Games have evolved at a rapid rate. Developers are not nearly as limited as they once were due to the evolution of hardware and are thus able to fully realize their creations. Because of this, many titles no longer follow a simple structure and are then composed of many elements. To give you an example, 1981's Galaga followed a simple structure that was akin to Space Invaders. The objective was simple, and it was to take out all enemies on the screen and to see how many waves you could survive. Games that follow this formula are still made today, but now the spotlight is cast at AAA titles that have budgets that rival the biggest movie blockbusters. Once a studio has a massive budget, it's able to make game environments more detailed, flesh out a story, add more content, and, probably the most controversial aspect, to immerse its players by presenting intense depictions of violence. As studios continue to push the envelope when it comes to presentation, many consider how it can cause detrimental effects to the player. The one major question that has been surrounding this issue is if it is possible that overexposure to violent content could compel a player to commit violent actions in the real world. For the most part, I would be leaning on the side that they do not. I believe that the issue is much more complicated, and we must go beyond the idea that games as a whole are the sole factor, and we must consider all options. My call to action is to try and educate consumers, whether it's through this video, or possibly through revisions to the ESRB, a ratings board used to inform customers of the content within games, that those who happen to play violent games will not take those messages that are presented and feel motivated to cause violent acts in the real world. Now, while it's easy to assume that being exposed to mature imagery may cause somebody to become violent, studies have proven that there have been little detrimental effects when it comes to the play of mature titles. It does not promote behavior that is deemed as violent, so to speak. This conclusion was reached based on a study that was conducted in 2010 by researchers at Texas A&M on 1,254 students that ranged from both the 7th and 8th grade, and it was in the attempt to collect data regarding the play habits of those students. The students who had participated within the sample also had a high attendance within the school system, and as a whole, 1,016 children within the sample, which roughly equates to 81%, had at least some recent exposure to violence in video games. Roughly 7% of the remaining participants also had little to no participation when playing violent video games. And then finally, 48% of those who participated within the survey were able to name at least one mature-rated title. Now, based on what was found within the study, we can conclude that the influence of mature video games has grown, but the real question is to whether or not they have any negative psychological effects on a child's behavior. The study makes the point that other elements could have an effect on the behavior of a child rather than the messages that are conveyed within video games. Such examples may include gender of the participant, parental involvement, extracurricular activity levels, and family and peer support. It is possible that a large amount of the delinquent attitudes that could be caused are coming from stress found from other activities. And this also strengthens the idea that other aspects such as environmental stresses are at play when it comes to influencing the behavior of those who partake in playing mature video games. Thus, the study is able to conclude that games alone do not cause the detrimental effects of individuals, making the situation much more complicated. Interpretation of messages is also another key factor when it comes to determining the effects a game may have on an individual. Professor Jesse Marczely, who studies evolutionary psychology, is under the belief that exposure to games does not make somebody inherently violent. He communicates this particular point by using an analogy related to rams. He says that if you exposed a male ram to media depicting males aggressively slamming their horns into other males, that doesn't suddenly mean your subject ram will be inspired to run out and challenge a rival. His chances of winning that contest haven't changed, so why should his behavior? He then applies this to a human study by using examples such as the movie Rambo and the game Dark Souls. Both of these are examples that deal with violent content, and while that may give somebody a cathartic experience, it does not mean that that same individual is going to naturally become violent because they know the potential consequences. However, if someone were able to prove that aggression does stem from playing a game, is it the messages of the game that are causing it, or is it another factor? A study conducted by researchers at both the University of Oxford and Rochester attempt to answer this question by conducting an experiment. This experiment consisted of allowing participants to play the video game Half-Life 2. During the play sessions, the researchers manipulated certain elements of the game to make the experience more challenging for the player. The purpose of this was to see if the player's inability to progress in the game would lead to a heightened sense of aggression. This hypothesis would be supported as researchers reported that those who had less mastery of the game's interface also reported increased levels of aggressive feelings. What these results basically mean is that the messages that are communicated within a game aren't what are raising the aggressions within players, but rather their inability to progress within a game. It's similar to, say, trying to do a math problem and not being able to figure out the solution. Now onto discussion questions. The first being, have you ever felt frustrated playing a game? And this can be from any type. It can range from playing Risk to Sudoku to even smartphone games or first-person shooter AAA titles. Has there ever been a game that has made you frustrated, and what other factors could possibly be at play when it comes to measuring aggression. So like I mentioned earlier, with environmental factors being a example, could there be something else that I didn't mention? And I'd like to leave you with a clip that actually brings up the issue between video games and real-world violence.
Doc, you play video games?
Yes, Rex. Video games are a proven coping mechanism, like any hobby. They've been shown to improve hand-eye coordination, problem-solving, social interaction, and self-confidence. And no studies have managed to prove a correlation between video games and violence.